everybody is here, I guess. Thank you all for coming. We have some visitors. Thank you guys for coming as well. We're going to get into our study here in just a second. Let's go ahead and begin with a word of prayer. Y'all please bow with me. Our good Father in heaven, we're so grateful, Father, for the gift of your Son and all the spiritual blessings that we have that are through him. Thank you so much, Father, for this opportunity we have to be with our church family on this Lord's Day evening, to worship you and to study your portion of your word and to encourage each other. Thank you for making this happen for us. Please be with us now as we continue our study in Matthew's Gospel. Let's pray in Christ's name and amen. All right, so Matthew is telling us the story about Jesus. So in our study now, we are now looking at the last week of Jesus leading up to his crucifixion. Now, on the Sunday of that last week, Jesus had entered into the city of Jerusalem there with great fanfare. And prior to this time, Jesus didn't like to draw a lot of attention to himself. But this time, he presents himself to the people there in Jerusalem as a king, riding in on a donkey, just as Zechariah had prophesied hundreds of years earlier. And people there lined the streets. They'd followed him into the city. They would shout, "Hosanna to the Son of David." So now, on the next day, it's Monday, and Jesus entered the temple. And inside the temple, he saw that God's house, which is a place that was designed for prayer and for worship, that the people there had turned it into a den of thieves. And those people in charge of this place, the priests and the Sadducees, they were more interested in getting a piece of the action than they were in facilitating prayer and worship. So Jesus, he couldn't ignore what was going on there, so he drove out the merchants and the money changers. And after this was done, he would spend the rest of that day healing and teaching people inside the temple. While all this was going on, the religious leaders, they watched. And as they watched Jesus and all the popularity that was showing to him, they grew madder and madder at Jesus as the day progressed. Now, the next day, Tuesday, Jesus returned to the temple and he resumed his teaching there. This time, the chief priests and the elders, they challenged Jesus. They said, "By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority?" And Jesus responded to them by asking them a question. He says, "All right, you tell me, what was the source of John the Baptist's authority? Was it from heaven or was it from man?" And what was their answer? "We don't know." So if they couldn't figure out the authority of John the Baptist, where he got his authority, then they were in no position to question Jesus where he got his authority. So Jesus didn't bother to answer them. Now, while the priests and the elders were still standing there, Jesus told them three parables, and we talked about these in our last time that we were together. Now, the first parable was a parable of the two sons. Jesus told them, "You're the son who said yes, but you didn't do the work." And Jesus told them that the tax collectors and the prostitutes, they were going to get into heaven before any of them would. The second parable was the parable of the landowner. After saying that parable, Jesus asked them, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to the tenants that killed his servants and his son? And they answered and said, "He will bring those wretches to a wretched end." So Jesus tells them, "You're right about that. But you guys are the tenants." And the third parable that Jesus gave that day was the parable of the marriage feast. So the point of that parable was to say that heaven was going to be open to all the people there. All are going to be invited, but receiving an invitation doesn't mean that you're going to be chosen. So God is going to choose those who choose him, and he's going to reject those who reject him. And all these parables, they point to the fact that judgment is coming. Judgment is imminent. He tells the religious leaders there, they were standing right there, that they would be scattered like dust. And that's where we left off with the last class. So now, after this smackdown, the Pharisees retreated to regroup and to plan their next attack on Jesus. This was their plan. They said, well, maybe we can get him to say something that will get some of the people to think twice about him. So let's trick him into saying something that would divide the crowd so that they'll start arguing with each other. All right, so what are some of the topics that people today like to argue about? Politics? Religion? Sports? Taxes? COVID? I mean, boy, things all like that. The climate, is it man-made, or, whatever you want to do with that. All right, all these subjects, no matter what it is, everybody's going to have their own strong opinions about these things. Do you agree with that? And often our minds will be made up about that. So seldom will there ever be any compromise between opposing views. And having opposing, opposite opinions, sometimes that just creates a wedge between people, doesn't it? So back to the Pharisees. They wanted to find a way to trap Jesus with his words. And so they would do this by asking him a loaded question about two volatile topics, politics and religion. So let's see what happens. So the Pharisees, they send some of their underlings, some of their disciples to Jesus to set the trap. And these people are accompanied by some of the Herodians. They start out by giving Jesus some false flattery. So turn to chapter 22, Matthew chapter 22, and look at verse number 16. We'll read that. Chapter 22, verse 16 says, this is their flattery. Teacher, we know that you speak and teach the way of God in truth, and you defer to no one, for you're not partial to anyone. And then they ask the trick question. What do you think? Is it okay to pay taxes to Caesar? All right, let me see a show of hands. Anybody here like to pay taxes? No. What happens to you if you choose not to pay your taxes? What's going to happen to you? Depends on who you are. All right. You may be right about that. But typically, generally speaking, what happens to people who don't pay their taxes? Yeah, the IRS, they have their ways, okay, and no one likes the IRS. So what do you think about people who are in favor, they're big supporters of imposing big taxes on you and me? What do you think about those people? Let's just say that we're not members of any of their fan clubs, are we, like that? Now, paying taxes to Roman oppressors, that was a sensitive issue back in first century Judea. So they asked Jesus, is it okay to pay taxes to Caesar? Now, why would this be a trick question? It's a trick question because no matter what Jesus answers, Jesus was going to be in trouble. So what would happen if Jesus said, yes, it's a good idea to send your money to Rome. I'm all for it. Well, what would happen? Well, he would alienate the Jews who hated paying taxes to Roman oppressors. People like that would say, our first allegiance is to Jehovah, and it's certainly not to Caesar. So I can't support Jesus if he's in favor of sending to Rome any of my money. What would happen to Jesus if he said, no, it's not okay. Don't send him a dime? Well, refusal to pay taxes was viewed as an act of sedition. And that's why the Herodians were asked to join in. Now, the Herodians, they were supporters of the Herod family and the rule of the family over Israel. The Herodians were more a political party than they were a religious sect. So if Jesus says, no, it's not okay, then the Herodians would go and report this comment by Jesus to the Romans. And you think the IRS is bad. Well, the Romans, they had ways of keeping people in line in those days. So maybe the thinking is, well, maybe the Romans, they'll take care of this Jesus problem for us. So let's see what he has to say about that. So yes and no. Okay, Jim? They were blind to a lot of things, weren't they? And that was still another sign of their hypocrisy. All right, so what would happen if Jesus actually refused to answer? Let's say he just said nothing at all. Well, then they would call him a coward. They say, well, he's just too afraid to take a stand. All right, so you see that no matter how Jesus answered, yes or no, or if he didn't answer at all, the Pharisees, they thought that they had him. Now Jesus, he knew their motive. He knew that it was evil. And so he exposes them. He says, why are you testing me? And what was Jesus' response? He said, well, show me a coin. Whose image is on there? They would say, Caesar's image. All right, then he said simply, then give back to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. So what does that mean? That means that you're to consider taxes as payment for services rendered. Those who benefit from government should support that government. But Jesus didn't stop there. He said, give back to God the things that are God's. That is, return the devotion and the obedience that was due to God. And they hadn't been doing that. Verse number 22, look and see what it says. Verse 22 says, and hearing this, they marveled, and leaving him, they went away. So on this day, Jesus 1, religious leaders 0. So later on, a group of Sadducees, they come up to Jesus. Now most of the rich and powerful people in the land, they were the Sadducees. And Matthew adds a little comment here in that the Sadducees, they rejected this idea of a future resurrection and the idea of an afterlife existence. So these Sadducees, they give Jesus a hypothetical situation about one woman who had been married to 7 different men. So they ask Jesus this question. In the afterlife, whose wife shall she be? All right, so why is this a trick question? Well, it's a trick question because in the afterlife, all 7 husbands would be around. So Jesus would have to say that one woman being legally married to 7 men at the same time, that was somehow okay. So imagine one woman, one wife, 7 husbands. Imagine the trouble and the confusion that would take place in that family. So no one in their right mind would say that a situation like that was going to be okay. So how could Jesus possibly endorse that type of situation? Well, the only way if he would endorse it was that he wasn't okay, that he was insane. Now another answer that they hoped what he would say was that Jesus was going to deny that there was even going to be a resurrection. So they were hoping that Jesus would say, well, it doesn't really matter. Everybody who dies is going to they're going to stay dead anyway. So the trouble with that is an answer like that is that it would call into question Jesus' own claims that he was going to be raised up. So any answer that Jesus gave, that was going to be used to discredit him amongst some of the people there. They were going to help to divide some people there. So how did Jesus answer this question? He says, you guys, you just don't get it. You don't understand the scriptures, and you're denying the power of God. See, a God powerful enough to create life is powerful enough to transform it in heaven. And heaven is going to be a place when there wasn't going to be any marriages. So every soul in heaven would be like the angels in heaven. The angels are not married to each other. So to deny that God can raise the dead and provide eternal life is to deny his power. So having said this, the Sadducees, they just stood there in silence. Verse 33 says, and when the multitudes heard this, they were astonished at his teachings. So Jesus 2, religious leaders 0. All right, sports fans. Anybody like sports out there? Who is the greatest athlete of all time? Jim Brown. Jim Thorpe. Babe Ruth. Okay. Michael Jordan. Okay, that's a little more contemporary, I guess. You're all wrong. The only correct answer is Deion Sanders, also known as Primetime. Deion Sanders, he was blessed with blazing speed. All right, he had supreme balance, and he had superb jumping ability. In college, he starred in 3 sports: baseball, football, and track. And he's the only man ever who played in both a Super Bowl and a World Series. He was by far the greatest defensive player ever in the NFL. No. Other teams, they would purposely not throw it to his side of the field because he was that good. So he was the best defensive player in all of the NFL. So again, there's no question that Leon Dion is the GOAT. So is everybody convinced? Is everybody okay with that? No? Okay, well, several. Dallas, San Francisco, at least those two, and he played at other places. And in World Series, did he play for the Braves? Did they win when he won? When he played? I don't know. Anyway, we can debate about this later on. All right. So I say that to say this now. It's said that in the law of Moses there are 250 positive commands, and that there are 365 prohibitions. So just as you and I can debate who the GOAT was, the greatest athlete of all times was, well, in the first century, speculating and debating on which was the greatest commandment in the law of Moses, that was a favorite pastime of all the religious folks who hung out there in the temple. So one of the Pharisees, a lawyer, he approaches Jesus and he asks him, which is the greatest commandment in the law of Moses? So what was Jesus' answer? Well, look at verse number 37. He quotes Deuteronomy 6:5, and that says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is a great and foremost commandment. And then Jesus expands his answer. Look at verse number 39. You shall love the Lord, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. So the greatest commandment is to love God and to love his people. All the other commandments, they stand on this great foundation of love. What a foundation. God is love, and love is from God. So the people who were there with Jesus, when they heard Jesus say these things, they had no idea that the greatest display of God's love was about to occur in just a few days after this, a few short days. All right. Someone tell me what algebra means. Anybody give me an answer? What is the definition of algebra? Well, I'll tell you. I wrote it down. No? All right. Letters and symbols are used to represent numbers and equations. All right? So I've written on this board this equation. C, a letter symbolized or for representing a number, is greater than D, something other than C, which is greater than C. Those are the same C's. Anything wrong with that equation? It's false. Why do you say it's false? Everybody agree with that? He said you can't have one number that's bigger than a number and still be less than that same number. Makes sense, huh? Yeah, we're going to get there. All right. So the religious leaders, their understanding about the Messiah was lacking. Just like our understanding of this for right now is lacking. They refused to believe that Jesus was the Messiah. So Jesus is going to use this particular algebraic equation to get them to thinking about a truth concerning the Messiah. So let's see what happens. So Jesus sees the Pharisees, they're huddled together. So he asks them a question. Verse number 42. What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? Now Jesus, when he says the Christ, he isn't talking about himself specifically here. He's using the Christ here, is just using it as a title. So he's asking them a theoretical question. Whose son is the Christ? And what was their answer? Son of David, right. So this is where the algebra starts. Their answer implies that David, the father, was greater than the Christ, his son. See, without a father, there can't be any son. When my son was in college and he brought people home to the house, I would always introduce myself, but I wouldn't introduce myself as being Alan's father. I would say, hi, I'm Bill. I'm Alan's creator. So in that sense, a father will always be greater than his son. So David, the father, is greater than the Christ, who was his son. You with me on that? Okay. So Jesus asked the follow-up question, verse number 43. He says, then how does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put thine enemies beneath thy feet. So Jesus here is quoting from Psalms 110. And every Jew could probably recite that psalm from memory. So it speaks of God giving dominion to a king that would put his foot on the necks of the neck of Israel's enemies. So David, who is a writer of this psalm, he calls this promised king Lord. So calling someone Lord is a concession that person, that you are lesser than that person. So Jesus calling the Christ Lord implies that the Christ is David's superior. Okay, you still with me? So then Jesus asks this question. Look at verse number 45. He says, if David then calls him Lord, how is he his son? So in other words, how can the Christ be greater than David and lesser than David at the same time? Christ is greater than David, which is greater than Christ. So that's the question that he asked them. And the Pharisees, they didn't understand. And that's why that they couldn't find anybody that was interested in answering Jesus' question. Now, they could have done so, but they didn't. So, what's the answer to this question? How can the Christ be greater than David and lesser than David at the same time? How can this be a true statement? Right. They couldn't answer it because they didn't understand it. The answer is that Christ is God and man at the very same time. So when that is the case, then this is a true statement. That's a true statement there. So again, they didn't understand that, and that's why they didn't answer it. They could have asked for an explanation, but they weren't interested in getting an explanation there. So from this moment on, Matthew tells us that no one dared to ask Jesus any more questions. Any questions about that? See? Math can be fun sometimes, even in Bible class. All right. In chapter 23 now, Jesus goes on the offensive. So it's still Tuesday, and the scribes and Pharisees are still there, but now Jesus turns his attention and he speaks to two different groups of people. He speaks to the multitudes, those who are friendly to him, and he speaks to his disciples, those who had been following him. So let's see what Jesus has to say about those scribes and Pharisees. Now, the scribes and Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Jesus said, these guys, they were not appointed by God as your teachers. This was something that they assumed by themselves. He said, therefore, all that they do, all that they tell you, do and observe. So is Jesus being sarcastic here? I mean, many times before, Jesus had condemned the Pharisees, their tradition-heavy doctrines there. Things like working on the Sabbath or healing on the Sabbath or divorce and remarriage, fasting and tithing and making offerings or whatever like that. What Jesus is saying here is that truth is binding no matter who is teaching it. So as long as they are teaching the truth, then listen to the truth, obey the truth. But be careful because they don't practice what they preach. They have exempted themselves from the rules and the regulations that they have been imposing on everyone else. Don't do that. Don't do what they do. But as long as they're teaching the truth, then listen to the truth, obey it. But what it says, what they do all They do all their deeds to be noticed by men. So they would find ways to show that they were more righteous than everybody else. They wanted to be up, they wanted to be up in front of everybody. They wanted to make sure that everybody could see them and to think that they were VIPs. And they enjoyed being called rabbi, which to them was a title of respect. So after talking about the scribes and Pharisees, Jesus now turns his attention to warning his listeners about them. He says, do not be called rabbi, and don't call anyone on earth your father or your leader. Why not call somebody rabbi, father, or leader, or any other religious title? It's because there's only one teacher, there's only one father, and there's only one leader. And who is that? God. So in God's kingdom, there are no titles that distinguish disciples from one another. We're all part of the same believing family that's made up of equals, brothers and sisters. So Jesus sums it all up here. He says, but the greatest among you shall be your servant. And whoever exalts himself shall be humbled. And whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. So haven't we heard this before from Jesus? I think so. This principle here, it occurs 10 times in all the Gospels. So Jesus honors and blesses true humility and service, and he condemns empty pride. So the bottom line is, don't be like the scribes and the Pharisees. Don't use religious services for personal come on. Back up. Forward. Oh, rats. There we go. Okay. PowerPoint button 1, seed and strang 0 here. All right. So don't be like the scribes and Pharisees. Don't use religious services for personal promotion. That's what the scribes and Pharisees were doing. Well, stupid thing. PowerPoint clicker 2. This will work. Let's see. Next. There we go. I'll use this thing instead. He says, the right motive for religious service is the salvation of souls. Not your, it's your own soul and the souls of everybody else as well. And this is what Jesus expects from all of his disciples. So next, Jesus is going to direct his comments directly to the scribes and the Pharisees. He knew that their religious service wasn't done for the salvation of anyone's soul. He knew that they were rotten to the core, and he had to expose them. Now, woe here can mean some lament over some bad situation, like woe is me. But Jesus uses this word here to signify impending doom, sorrow, wrath, and condemnation of God. And Jesus is going to accuse the scribes and the Pharisees of 8 different offenses, and each time he's going to refer to them as hypocrites. And we talked about this word hypocrite before. Anybody remember what that means? It's a Greek word for actor, right? It describes one who wasn't who wasn't what he appeared to be, someone who was a phony. So here's a fun fact. Jesus is the only one in the New Testament that uses this word hypocrite. Now the first of these woes is against religious leaders who actually make men irreligious. So look at it this way. Because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from men, for you do not enter yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering in. All right, picture yourself in the front of Tampa General Hospital. And there's a group of men there that are kind of blocking the way into the door there. Inside Tampa General Hospital, there are doctors, there are nurses, and there are machines, and there's all kinds of medicines that are going to help provide healing to people. Now, the men blocking the door, they don't know it, but they're sick. Okay, they just don't realize it. They're sick. So not only do they not go in, but they're also preventing other people from going in as well. So what's the end result of that? Well, there's no healing at all. So by opposing Jesus and his teachings, the Pharisees, they not only kept themselves out of the kingdom of heaven, but they were preventing others from entering in as well. See, they thought of themselves as leaders of the true religion of God, but in reality, they were nothing but stumbling blocks. They were the ones, they were obstacles that were preventing people who wanted to be obedient to God's truth, people who wanted to get into God's kingdom from entering into there. Now, the second woe is for using the pretense of prayer to cover up their plundering of the defenseless. Now, widows in that society, they were particularly vulnerable. In devouring widows' houses, that indicates that they were taking advantage of them in some way. So instead of protecting the widows, they were exploiting them. In saying long prayers, this was just their way of saying, well, look at us. See how much we care about the poor? We pray for them a very long time. So, but really, in reality, their long prayers, that was just a cover-up of their evil actions. So Jesus tells these guys, woe unto you, because you're going to receive a greater condemnation. And Jesus said that they would enthusiastically, they would go about all, to great lengths in trying to convert people into Judaism. But what was happening was they were really more interested in converting a person to the sect of being a Pharisee than anything else. So when they succeeded in doing that, they made this new convert situation even worse than it was before. You see, by embracing a legalistic system of that the Pharisees that they were championing, then a new convert was going to be less likely than ever to accept Jesus as the Messiah. And this new convert was going to be less likely to understand Jesus' kingdom. So Jesus says to these guys, woe unto you, because you made this man worse off than before. Now the fourth woe accuses the Pharisees of spiritual blindness. So blindness here is Jesus' way of describing disobedience, or a failure to understand and apply the truth. So in this woe, blindness is illustrated by their dishonesty involving oath-taking. And Jesus covered this issue of taking and giving oaths in the Sermon on the Mount. We talked about that earlier. So the Pharisees, they had found ways to kind of cross their fingers behind their backs. They would find clever loopholes that would justify the breaking of an oath that was given. So Jesus calls it for what it is. He just calls it, this is just nothing but blatant dishonesty. He says, woe unto you. And the fifth one condemned let's go back. Well, let's not go back. The fifth one condemned the Pharisees for missing the mark, missing the target there. You can see the arrows hitting the thing. That's getting dangerous here with this thing. So the law of Moses, it required tithes of seeds and fruit and grains and oil and animals. So the Pharisees, they were demanding an inordinate attention to the trivial. And while they're doing that, they were neglecting the most important matters, justice and faith. Get rid of that. Sorry about this thing. We'll get that thing straightened out next time. All right. But the problem with, the tithes, originally when they were set up, they were designed to be an opportunity to celebrate God's blessings and to share the Lord's blessings. But the Pharisees and the scribes, they had perverted this system. They'd make tithing into some ritual that was disconnected at all from true devotion to the Lord. So this mint, tithe, or mint, dill, and cumin, those are just little tiny spices, all right? They're little tiny herbs used for flavoring food. But the Pharisees, they would be so preoccupied with precisely measuring out one little piece of mint from 9 other pieces of mint that they're just missing out. They neglected the more important things like justice and mercy and faithfulness. So the problem was that they were so preoccupied with trivial externals that they had neglected the more important matters of the heart. So the next, yes. Quick comment, yes.
The statement Jesus makes in verse 23, I believe, is just a transcendent statement, because here he tells us what are the weighty matters of law, those that are most weighty. He says he neglected the weightier matters of law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Now Luke 11 tells us it's a similar passage, maybe parallel passage. He has love in that, justice, mercy, and love. And
Those are the more important things than certainly some of the lesser items that they talked about, like tithing these small pieces of herb. All right, thank you so much. All right, the sixth woe here exposes the inward hearts of their sin. And Jesus uses the example of a dish and a cup. All right, every Thursday morning, a bunch of us will meet at Bob Evans. Thursday morning, I'm there at 7 o'clock, and when I get there, the table's already there, prepared. It's, the cup's on the table, and there's a full pot of coffee there, and everything's ready to go. But one thing I notice is that Brother Truex, when he shows up, before he pours any coffee in his cup, he always takes that cup and he inspects the inside of it. Every time. So, why do you do that, Don?
Because anytime I have found something inside.
Okay. All right. Okay, so, the cup may look clean on the outside, but inside the cup there might be something lurking, is what you're saying there. All right, so in any event, that's good. I'm glad you're doing that. No one else does that, but I'm glad that you're doing that. And you actually found something one time? Oh, really? At Bob Evans? Wow. Well, that was meant for somebody else. I didn't put that for you. No thanks. So the point is, in any event, a dirty cup, no matter how clean it looks on the outside, it's not fit for use if it's dirty inside. So on the outside, the Pharisees, they look good. Well, on the outside they look good, but on the inside they were full of extortion and a greedy spirit that was going to rob other people there. So Jesus calls on these scribes and Pharisees to repent. He says, first clean out your hearts, and when that's done, then the outside will become clean as well. Now the seventh woe is similar to the sixth one, and this is a contrast between the outer and the inner. Now in the first century, the Jews, they would whitewash their tombs, and they did this because so that people wouldn't accidentally stumble upon a tomb as they were traveling on their way into the feast. Because touching anything that was dead, that made you unclean. And being unclean was going to prevent you from participating in any religious services. So the practice then was to paint these tombs with some white limestone dust. So it made the outside of the tombs appear clean, it looked clean, but on the inside, we know it just contained bones and decaying bodies. So Jesus is saying here that the scribes and the Pharisees, they appeared to be righteous, but anyone who came in contact with them, they too would become polluted. So if you see a whitewashed tomb, avoid it. And likewise, if you see a scribe or a Pharisee, we'll stay away from him as well. Now the eighth woe rebukes the Pharisees for being like those before them who had killed the prophets of God. So throughout Jerusalem during that time, there were many tombs, there were many memorials that were erected there, and they contained the names of celebrated righteous prophets who lived a long time ago. Now the scribes and the Pharisees, they falsely claimed that they would have never participated in killing these prophets. Not us. We are much, much better than our forefathers. They're the ones that killed the prophets. We are far more righteous than they were. But they're going to be wrong about that. You see, in their killing of Jesus, they would commit a crime that was far greater than anything that was done by any people in the previous generations. So Jesus tells them, you're just like those who before had killed the righteous men of God. You are sons of those who murdered the prophets. So those are the woes that Jesus gave to the Pharisees and the scribes who are standing there. So can you imagine them standing there, taking all this in? You reckon this made them feel any more favorable to Jesus? No. They couldn't do anything because of the crowds there. But they were burning inside their hearts. They didn't like this at all, and they had to find some way to silence this man. Now, before Jesus concludes his last public address, he's going to express one final thought. He's going to mourn over the nation and its people. He's going to mourn over the city, Jerusalem, where God had shown so much love and so much mercy to so many people and so many generations, because Jesus now sees the dark fate that is awaiting the city. So let's read what he says to them. And these are words that come from a broken heart. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who were sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. You were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on you shall not see me until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And so with these words here, Jesus' public ministry was finished.
I say unto you, the public and the college when the kingdom of God is believed. Someone said that to any of us? Is this religious discussion? Or you get to the end of, you get to the end of 23, you serpents, you generation of vipers. How can you escape the damnation of hell? The things that he is saying are so strong. In this discourse in 23, he is basically showing the heart of official Judaism is run to the core. Expose the prophecy of it, and I'm sure as hard as I can. And then when they say that they want to go after him, but they know they can't take him. He is taking a forester and pushing it. And just imagine someone coming in on your class causing such discord, you lose in the class, this person's taking it over, and you've got no defense. And you walk out of here with the frustration you and your wife would have, it would be unbelievable. And so it would be a part of you. Everyone's waiting the next time we come together. Jesus has done that to them. He has taken them apart. And now they've got to do something. And he's got to get it done the next few days. And he is pushing as hard as he can. And he is throwing some serious, serious gas in their hearts.
Thank you. I agree with that. So everybody hear that? That's you see the progression that has been taking place, and will culminate here in a few more days. All right. So again, these are Jesus' last words in his public ministry here. So he's going to leave the temple in the city, and he's going to prepare himself for a great sacrifice for the sins of all the world. That's what happens next. We will come back in on next Sunday. We have a singing on Wednesday. So next Sunday we're going to come back. We're going to talk about chapter 24, which is some interesting topics within that. So if you have a chance, read chapter 24 and come together, and we'll study that at that time. Thank you all for coming, and we will see you again on next Sunday. Oh, my clicker. Yeah, I'll swap the batteries out and see what happens.
Another example of wanting to look good rather than be good. Right?
Oh, yeah, what, the clickers?
No, just the Pharisees.
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, I thought you were talking about me.
No.
Yeah.
And then we tend to look at people in the Old Testament, they do these awful things. And we tend to say,